Hey everybody, today we're going to continue our investigation of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model by looking more specifically into the aggregate supply curve. To be accurate, there are actually two supply curves that we're interested in with our model. The first is the short-run aggregate supply curve, sometimes denoted as SRAS, and the long-run aggregate supply curve, LRAS. And before we get too deep into it, we should make sure that we understand what is the difference between the short run and the long run. And what we're talking about is realizing that there are thousands of variables, thousands of factors impacting the overall economy at any one time. The short run is a period of time during which at least one of those variables, one of those factors, is fixed. That is, something is not changing. So that's not a specific period of time more than it's just sort of a concept that if something is not changing because it cannot be changed at the moment, then we are in the short run. That something, we're going to find out here in just a minute, is typically wages. The long run is any period of time during which all of the variables that are impacting the economy, all of the factors that go into macroeconomics are fully variable. And so when we do our analysis, we're going to start by looking at the short run and then looking at how the economy adjusts as we move toward the long run. So what's fixed? Typically in the short run, we're talking about wages. And wages are considered, quote, sticky because they tend to be fixed for a short period of time. When you think about labor, think about contracts. A teacher signs a contract for the year. Their salary is set for that year. It's not going to change until the contract is up, and then salaries can be renegotiated. And so just about any profession has the same issue. You've got a certain wage, and it stays fixed for a period of time until the contract is up or until some sort of event occurs that causes the wages to change. In an article from the Wall Street Journal, they noted that wages are what economists call sticky because they don't change as fast as other prices do. As they mention, the prices on a gas station for gas can change at a moment's notice. Restaurants can change their menus relatively quickly, but you don't typically get an increase in salary every time the price of a good goes up. And so because wages don't change, we typically have a short-run situation that lasts anywhere between 6 months to a year. Now, the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, and that's based on the profit motive. Because if wages are sticky, if the biggest cost to production, which is wages, doesn't change in the short run, then increasing price levels generally means that the profit per unit of the units we're selling is going up. If I can get a higher price, but my costs are basically fixed, then I have a larger profit for every unit I sell, which then incentivizes me to offer a greater quantity supplied if price levels are higher than if they were lower. So as price levels rise with sticky wages, we tend to see a greater incentive to produce more goods, and therefore we see an upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. The long run, however, is a little different because in the long run, there's nothing sticky. Everything's variable. So if price levels rise by 5%, then presumably workers will want their wages to rise by 5%. And so if the price level rises and the costs of labor rise at the same rate, then there's no increased incentive to produce a greater quantity supplied than we were already making. And so because of that, the long-run aggregate supply curve tends to be a vertical line. And that vertical line intersects the horizontal axis at what we call potential output. This is the amount of goods and services our economy would be producing with the existing set of resources in the long run. It is also a quantity that we call full employment. So if our short-run equilibrium is less than potential output, we would then say and be able to determine from our analysis that there is an increase in unemployment, that we are not fully producing all that we could be, that there are some unused resources out there, and therefore there is an increase in unemployment. And if we were to have an output greater than potential output, then we would have sort of a short-run, heated-up economy in which employment would be greater than full employment. In essence, we'd have negative cyclical unemployment. We'd be hiring people who were not really qualified for the job simply because there's so much demand for them that we didn't have time to wait to train them. We'll just figure it out on the job. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift primarily for three reasons. One, because of a change in commodity prices like oil or rubber or gas or something like that, steel. And then they'll change because of, or shift because of a change in nominal wages, and it'll shift because of changes in productivity. The short answer here is short-run aggregate supply curves will shift either to the left or right based on the cost of doing business. If the cost of doing business is rising, we're going to see a left shift in aggregate supply. If we see the cost of business beginning to shrink or be reduced, then we generally see a right shift in short-run aggregate supply. So commodity prices are really what we call bulk inputs: oil, steel, copper, rubber, all the things that go into making stuff. So this is very manufacturing centric. If the cost of all of those ingredients or inputs or materials, raw materials, were to change, that would affect the cost of doing business for a company, and therefore is going to cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. So ask yourself this question: how would the short-run aggregate supply change if the commodity prices that we're dealing with are rising, if it's becoming more expensive to make stuff than it was before? So think about that for a second, pause the video, come up with an answer, and then press play again and see if you're right. In this case, if you said aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the left, then you would be correct. An increase in commodity prices is basically going to lower the profit per unit of a business because now it's more expensive to make stuff than it was before. So at every price that I could charge for my good, I'm making less for it. That's going to cause me to produce fewer items than before and cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. So we'll have less aggregate supply than before. Another reason why aggregate supply curve will shift is because of a change in nominal wages. Wages, as I said, are the largest cost for firms. And so when wages change, it changes the cost of doing business. So the question in this case is, how would short-run aggregate supply curve change if nominal wages increased, if I had to pay my workers more money than before? So take a minute, think about it, pause the video, really sort of check yourself and see where you think short-run aggregate supply curve is going to go. Then press play and see if you were correct. In this case, if wages rise, we're talking about an increase in the cost of doing business, and that will cause short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. Now, nominal wages are the most difficult concept for most students when it comes to understanding changes in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So be sure that you understand this. Wages are initially a cost of doing business. So the first person who is impacted by a change in wage is the business, because they're the ones that have to write the check. Yes, the employee gets more wages. Okay, fine. So a lot of times people think that's aggregate demand. It's not. We're looking at initial impacts, one change at a time. So try not to jump ahead in the story. Just stick to the first and only change. And the first and only change when it comes to wages is that the business is impacted. And in this case, when wages rise, costs increase, businesses will produce less. Short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. Now, is that where the story ends? No. But in most of our analyses, we're looking at initial impacts first, okay? So don't jump the gun. Keep in mind, wages are a supply curve issue. Last thing here has to do with productivity. And productivity impacts costs. If I can produce more goods with the same number of resources, then the average cost of production has dropped. Okay? Things like hand price scanners make workers in an inventory situation a whole lot quicker. If you're in a store trying to count up how many items you have on your shelves, then it's much easier if you just take a scanner and go boop, 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 instead of having to rely on a human being to keep a tally mark on a clipboard, for example. You don't need as many workers, it doesn't take as much time, and therefore it's less expensive. So think about this for a moment. If short-run aggregate supply curve is going to change, is it going to change by shifting to the right or left if productivity increases? Again, press pause, and then when you think you're ready, go ahead and press play again and see if you're right. With an increase in productivity, costs will drop. The cost of doing business now is less than before. That means that if I'm charging the same price as before, I will get a greater profit than before. I will make more stuff than I was in the past because it costs me less to make and makes me more money. So anytime you see an increase in productivity, we would see short-run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right. If productivity were to decrease for some reason, then we'd see short-run aggregate supply curves shifting to the left. What's going to cause long-run aggregate supply curve to shift? It's going to shift essentially when we can permanently produce more goods and services than before. Or, I guess if there was something bad that happened, permanently produce less. But really, we sort of hope that it's always moving to the right and not to the left. Long-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift if we have an increase in the available resources. For example, we figure out where to find more oil, or we produce carbon-less energy with like a nuclear fusion reactor, which doesn't exist right now but may one day, and basically drop the cost of energy significantly, then great, we can produce more stuff, right, with the same amount of resources as before. Or the quality of resources is better. Maybe I can get more goods out of the same amount of resources. I'm just more efficient. Maybe I don't have as much waste because I've got a better manufacturing process than before. Then my permanent ability to produce increases, and we would see a right shift in long-run aggregate supply. Or if technology gets better. And again, that's going to be talking about increasing our productivity. And if the technology we have permanently makes us more efficient than before, then that's a good sign, and long-run aggregate supply will shift to the right. So think about things like automation and computerization that allow businesses to do more with fewer workers and fewer resources than ever before. And that causes the overall potential output to increase and shift to the right. We'll continue our conversation in class. You'll have a chance to work on more problems and ask questions, and I will see you then.